Welcome, everybody, to episode 113 of Axioms on Trial. Today, we're going to be talking about schizophrenia. I'm going to bring my guest in right away. Thank you, Niels, for joining us.
Hello, my name's Nils. Yeah, should I introduce myself?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm your average, schizophrenic person. I might be on the street beside you or sitting on the bus, or you might see me just ordering a coffee, but you may not realize I suffer from schizophrenia. Thankfully, or nicely enough, Cease over here has allowed me to come on his show and talk about schizophrenia and inform you guys about certain things, what it's like to live with the condition, and more importantly, what it's like to build a philosophical framework around living with schizophrenia, since you can't really think the same way that normal people do without falling into victim to some more nefarious hallucinations.
Yeah, so I guess the first question I want to ask you is, how did you find out you were suffering from this condition? And what is it like to live with this on a daily basis?
Yeah, so as for how I figured it out, I didn't figure it out, actually. For the longest time, I'm a weird case where I seem to have been born with some sort of schizoaffective disorder or something wrong with my brain, such that I developed it way earlier than most people. And so I hallucinated from a very young age. But as time went on, it got worse and I became more paranoid and stuff like that. And so I had to go and see doctors, which started to give me certain diagnoses. And the diagnosis process is actually quite rigorous in the sense that they make you do way too many tests and questionnaires to try and figure out where exactly your mental state is on average, since they do these questionnaires where questions will overlap and sometimes you'll be asked the same question, but it'll happen over the course of many different days. And then they'll be like, okay, well, he generally answers this way, or she generally answers that way on these days, et cetera, et cetera. And they seem to figure out an average based on that. And they seem to make a diagnosis. And at first, they didn't diagnose me with schizophrenia. They gave me an anxiety disorder. And then they gave me depression, and they gave me bipolar disorder, and it kind of stacked on until they were like, oh, it might be schizophrenia, which is causing all of these other symptoms and problems.
Right, that makes sense. And what is the nature of these hallucinations? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay. So the nature of hallucinations, in my example or in my personal experience, they usually deal with, strangely enough, eldritch horrors or like shadow people. And shadow people are pretty common, actually. But the eldritch horrors are less common. And that's because I liked reading a lot of Lovecraft and stuff like that when I was younger. And that kind of tailored my hallucinations in that way. One of the things that's kind of weird about schizophrenia is, depending on the person, you'll hallucinate different things. Because the best way to describe schizophrenia is the same way you would describe any mental illness, where it's a normal part of human existence or the human brain that's cranked up to an unhealthy level. An example for schizophrenia would be your pattern recognition. That's cranked up way too high. So your brain will start finding patterns where there aren't any. Same way that your brain might find patterns in clouds and say, oh, that cloud looks like a truck, or hey, I found Jesus in toast. Your brain will be like, hey, I found an entire monologue in the static of your TV. And then your brain will extrapolate on that information and be like, maybe this means something. And so it'll just take that and go haywire. But depending on what information you're keen to or what information you expose yourself to, you'll get different hallucinations, as it's really just a magnification of what's already there.
Sure.
But in my case, it was like eldritch horrors, which were not fun. But there are some common ones like shadow people. Shadow people is pretty common. Sorry if these are long-winded answers.
No, no, at all. You're fine. No, I'm interested. And so you would hear. Uh, you're saying by auditory, you would hear things that weren't there. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, and they would kind of you can kind of get them to manifest into voices. I don't know what voices are exactly. It's hard to kind of explain them from a first person perspective, other than you hear things that aren't there, and sometimes they talk to you into longer sentences or chains of words that have meaning. But it's hard to tell if that's just another aspect of your pattern recognition going haywire, or if it's some sort of thing about like a schizophrenic person's fractured psyche.
And are you comfortable sharing some of what these voices have said?
Oh, yeah. Mostly my voices in my experience have been negative, where they've told me to do kind of self harming things. But there've also been positive voices, I would say, where an example would be I'm doing some sort of math equation or doing some sort of math test in university, and there will be a question that I'm having trouble with, and a voice will essentially give me the answer. And I'll quickly write that down, and then I'll think, okay, I'll come back to this later. And then usually the answer that a voice will give me will be right. Now, that happens less now that I'm medicated, but that used to happen when I didn't take any sort of medication for my schizophrenia.
What are several factors that you think contribute to the risk of developing this illness?
One of them that's definitely a huge factor is drug use. If you use anything like marijuana, that can actually increase. Like they've done studies on this where marijuana does seem to be linked with what's it called again? Early development of schizophrenia, especially in younger people. So if you're young, you probably shouldn't smoke marijuana, especially around the ages of 20 or like 18 and stuff like that, because that's where the highest risk of developing schizophrenia seems to be, or that's where when people seem to develop schizophrenia. Trying to think of other things. It seems to be a pretty strange, like that's like the main thing to kind of avoid is just like drug use, really. And then other than that, I can't really think of ways that you can avoid getting schizophrenia, because if you have the gene, or if you seem to have like the brain to develop schizophrenia, you will, given certain circumstances of like high stress or drug use, et cetera, et cetera. It's just kind of avoiding those things, I guess. Sorry, that was kind of, hey, fix it in post, Johnny.
No,
Make it a little more cohesive.
No. This sounds clear to me. No, I'm following what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Are there different types of schizophrenia?
Yeah, there are. There's like a huge list. I should actually bring it up. Schizophrenia types. There's, oh my God. There's paranoid, hebephrenic, catatonic, undifferentiated residue, simple, unspecified. But like I have an unspecified schizophrenia where it seems to kind of overlap with a bunch of different things. Paranoid schizophrenia is something that usually develops later in life and has to do with like hallucinations and delusions and stuff like that. But there are other ones. And what's it called again? I don't know too much about the other ones, and I don't feel comfortable speaking about them because I'm not like an expert. I can only really talk about personal experience.
And you said that with you, one of the things you were struggling with is falling into delusions.
Yeah. One of the things that can be really weird is you can get so convinced of a hallucination that it suddenly becomes real and you'll start following it. So one of the examples I give is the story of how during, I think it was the coldest night in the city I was studying, in for university. And I left out the door in just my pajamas in like colder than -30 weather. And I started walking in this direction with nothing but my pajamas and a simple thin coat. And I felt nothing but the drive to figure out where I was going because I felt some sort of divine calling. And it was just complete delusion.
Right. Do you have other examples as well?
Yeah.
Of
So another one would be once I was going for a walk and I was in a forest, and I probably should have avoided going into a walk through a dark forest at night because I suddenly had some sort of strange delusion where I started to hear footsteps behind me, and I felt like something was following me into the point where I broke down crying in a forest until I realized, I I'm just falling under a strange delusion, or like, how should I say it? I'm having a psychotic episode.
Sure.
And so none of this is actually real. I just need to get my bearings on reality again.
Right. Makes sense. How helpful would you say, like, well, let me say it this way. How successful have treatments, and what are the treatments for schizophrenia been? Like, I know some of it is medication, but are there other forms of treatment outside of medication, or is it just medication?
Yeah, so it depends on the individual. So depending on who you are, you might require some sort of therapy. So I went through CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and that fixed other problems that were related to my schizophrenia, such as I had a general anxiety disorder, because if I could deal with my anxiety, it was less likely for me to hallucinate, because stress can induce hallucinations, right? Keeping a good mind, it's kind of like there's nothing you can't get rid of it, but you can get rid of the things that make it bad.
Right.
And that's kind of the treatment for it. It's figuring out what are the things that are in my control and how can I control them, such as my anxiety. Well, I can go to therapy for anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy, where they outline and try and remodel your behaviors and thinking patterns so that you are less likely to do things that would make you anxious, or stop following or indulging in anxious thinking patterns or anxiety inducing patterns. Helped reduce my stress and reduced my hallucinations in that way. Medication also helps a lot, since you can't always just rely on, like, sometimes you can do everything right, but sometimes the brain chemicals just don't work properly and you need some sort of medication.
Sure, that makes sense. What would you say are some common misconceptions that the public may have about what it's like to have schizophrenia?
I feel like one thing that's kind of annoying is the idea or the perception that schizophrenic people are violent, which is so weird to me because at least I don't think I'm violent. I just think I'm an idiot. So I'm not going to hurt you unless it's by accident. And even if I'm having like a psychotic episode, it's probably not going to end up with me being violent against someone. Mainly because it feels like when you're having psychosis or suffering from some level of psychosis, it's magnifying what's already there. So if you aren't a violent person already, or you don't already deal with stuff through violence, you're probably not going to act very violently.
How often are these episodes taking place?
They used to happen more often when I wasn't medicated, and same thing with hallucinations. Like, they were almost not perpetual, but like they would happen. Like, I would at least hear voices every day. Sometimes it would just be like whispers and like little talking in the background, like if that's sorry, I had to make like a little sound effect because that's the best way
No, no,
to describe it.
yeah.
and that's what you're hearing a lot of the time, and it'll just be like talking, or you might hear little voices or like whispers and background noise like that,
Do you
or it
know?
might. Oh, sorry.
No, I was wondering, like, are you aware of any research that's has come up with like explanations for how these hallucinations are occurring? Like, what is it that's going on in the brain that can create a sound that isn't there? I'm fascinated by that phenomena.
Yeah. So what it seems to be, or what they think it has to do with, is overstimulation in the frontal lobe through either excess dopamine or other means. That's why some of the medication that you take will reduce the amount of dopamine being sent to your frontal lobe, or the sensitivity of your frontal lobe to dopamine. And but overall, I don't think they have like a cohesive explanation of what causes schizophrenia, because it seems to be like the only link that I seem to understand, or that I have seen between people who are schizophrenic, is that extreme version of pattern recognition, where they'll extrapolate on data beyond what makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Also, it doesn't help that historically, I'm pretty sure they used to give everyone the kind of diagnosis of schizophrenia for like all sorts of different things. So it kind of had that blanket term of crazy
sure.
tied to it.
How old were you when you realized, or when you were diagnosed?
I believe I was around 21 or
Okay.
20.
And how long ago was that?
Um, Not too many years ago, uh, less than a decade.
Gotcha. Um, I'm trying to think. I wanted to ask as well. What would you say are the largest? I mean, aside, of course, from the specific symptoms, um, does having this disorder, how has it impacted the way that you view life in comparison to others that might not have that problem?
Okay, this is where you're really going to have to cut me off if I go too long, because this is where I find it really fascinating, the differences between the people who have schizophrenia and those who don't. Because I need a very, very strict epistemology to understand and differentiate between real life and hallucinations. If something doesn't follow the simple laws of physics that all things follow, then something's wrong. For example, I may hallucinate a creature that's crawling on the roof. Okay, well, can a creature of that size, namely something human-sized, crawl on the roof? Of course not. Not unless it had some extremely powerful, grippy hands. And I don't see that in the hallucination. So I'm like, okay, that's one hint that it's a hallucination. It's not making sense in that way. Visually, it just doesn't look like it would work out. And I can keep pushing this to things like, okay, why do I know that the Earth is round, for example? Well, the sun sets. How do I explain that on like a flat Earth? That just doesn't make sense. It only really makes sense on a round Earth, right? And so I can extrapolate off these ideas, and in a sense, I'm using that pattern recognition to debunk the hallucinations that they're creating, which is kind of like up yours, schizophrenia. I'm using you to debunk you and keep a very straightforward and consistent view of reality.
So to some extent, it's applying the scientific method and what the background knowledge that you have about how the world works to make sure that these things you're experiencing you can recognize are out of the ordinary. They're out of that uh, natural pattern of things that from prior experiences the case, and then you can become aware of what seems to be out of norm, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Gotcha. Um, Aunt asks, How does the pattern recognition of schizophrenia differ from that of autism?
I don't know exactly because I'm sadly diagnosed. They're pretty sure I have autism as well, though I have never walked in to get the formal diagnosis, though my psychiatrist urges me to, just so they can have more information to work with. But it's kind of like if I am autistic, then I don't know if that changes much. So there might be some wires crossed there. But when I do describe these symptoms to my psychiatrist, he does seem to agree that they are pretty similar amongst the patients other patients he's seeing that have schizophrenia.
Sure. And how, well, were you scared when you first got diagnosed?
Not really, though that might be because when I was first diagnosed, I didn't know anything about it really. And then I started to Google more stuff about it, and then I got a little spooked. But because there's a lot of negative endings towards it, but as much as there are negative endings, there are like positive stories as well of people who just live on with it. And those are probably not reported as much because, the most horrifying stories are always will be reported on. And so I it does get a little scary, but like you do realize it's more so just like a thing you have to deal with and work with.
How what are things that loved ones and family members can do to support someone who's struggling with these disorders?
Oh, one of the things that is very helpful is just, and it's the same thing that helps everyone, is just sitting down and listening. Like, one of the things that's most frustrating is when you're having some sort of like hallucination and someone's like, bro, you're just crazy. It's like, yes, I know I'm crazy. I need someone who can listen, though. It's not, and I don't need someone to affirm that the hallucinations I'm seeing. I just need someone to sit down and be like, I hear you. There's blah, blah, blah. There's blah, blah. Let's think about this. Okay, what's going on, et cetera, et cetera. Just like understanding and listening to someone and then trying to slowly calm them down and make
Right.
them feel heard. Another thing is making sure that they are just check in on someone every once in a while. Don't be not to say like you have to micromanage everything in their life, but to check in and be like, hey, did you have lunch or something, or did you make your lunch today? Or like send me a picture of your. But you could ask it in a kinder way, like or a more stealthy way, like, hey, why don't we share pictures of what we ate today? And then it could be like, oh, we're keeping tabs on each other, making sure we ate, et cetera, et cetera. Because physical health is really important when it comes to mental health. Those things go hand in hand.
For sure.
And if you're not keeping your physical health up, your mental health is also probably going to plummet.
And I think you mentioned this earlier, but Andre was asking, I think they came in a little bit later, what type of schizophrenia did you say you have?
Mine's unspecified because it seems to overlap with a bunch of different ones, but the one it's most similar to is paranoid schizophrenia.
Um, I mean, I know this is probably going to be different from person to person, but is there like a general um, pattern of uh, how long it usually takes to figure out the right dose of medication and combination of medications? Or is it really just completely up onto the individual?
That's a good question because I'm still having modifications to my medication
Gotcha.
in terms of dosage. If I may say it, I would take Abilify, and before that, I took something called fluoxetine. Fluoxetol? I always forget its name. It's like flo. Um, flu. Ox. Yeah, fluoxetine. And I took that as something, I think it was fluoxetine or something similar to that. Sorry. I'm trying to remember the exact one, but it slips my mind. But yeah, I took that, and that kind of turned me into a zombie. And then I switched to Abilify, which is much better, but it still makes me somewhat forgetful. And one of the things that's weird is not hearing voices anymore, and that was very jarring. So that not necessarily a side effect, more so that that's the medicine working properly, but
Sure.
it does
Um,
feel very jarring to have that silence.
that's fair, especially if it's something you were so used to.
Mm-hmm.
And, do you know, are there other people, other members in your family that suffer from it as well?
It's hard to tell because I'm from an immigrant family. So they don't have a very good idea of mental health. Mental health isn't very well documented in the country they're from, which is Bangladesh. Uh, and it's extremely difficult to figure out if people in my family tree did have schizophrenia or if they had other mental illnesses or whatever. I do know that on both sides of my family tree, there does seem to be mental illness running through it of some kind, but
Sure.
I don't know if anyone can be diagnosed with exactly schizophrenia.
Right.
But it does seem like hallucinations and stuff like that are prominent in my family tree.
Have you grown up in the US?
In Canada, actually.
Or in Canada? Okay. Um, so is I know that to some degree, even though it's maybe changing a little bit here, mental illness is still somewhat taboo here in the US. There's a combination of it both. I think it's a problem of both over medication and over diagnosing, as as well as a lot of stigma that comes with it. And is it the same thing in Canada?
Yeah, mostly it is because sadly, what as America does, Canada usually follows. Our politics and our zeitgeist, our cultural zeitgeist, isn't usually too far behind America's, as much as we like to pretend it is.
Hmm.
Or not too far ahead of America's, I should say, as much as we pretend it is. So there are still like a lot of problems. Like I've heard my fair share of like Canadians or met my fair share of Canadians who have no idea what schizophrenia is like or what causes it or anything really about it.
And when I was Andre writes, when I was in the psych ward in December, there was a lady there who, after her treatment, when she stopped hearing voices, she said she was bored. The voices that you hear tell you to do anything.
They tell me to do many things in different times. Like um, some of the more negative voices told me to like do negative things to myself or self harm. But there are also a lot of voices that kind of kept me company, discussed things with me. It's kind of helped me shape my view of the world in a sense to have another voice to always play things off of. It's the same way that you might always have another person to play things off of, but instead it was just another voice.
And what did some of those conversations go like? What? How did it help you figure out some things? What was that process like?
Well, it's kind of like it's it's hard to describe because I'm not. It feels the same as talking to a friend over a number of different problems. Like, hey, uh, I'm thinking this, I'm thinking that, but they give you advice that is this extremely cohesive in the sense that it's as if they know exactly what you're going through, which is funny because they kind of do. Because as far as I can tell, these voices are just you,
Right.
unless the religious people are right and I am truly possessed by spirits.
I doubt that. Yeah. Randy asks, "How do you trust that voice?" And I think, like we were saying earlier, sort of depends on what's being said and depends on what uh, the hallucination is, right?
Yeah, so I actually don't trust like really any of my voices, and I've kind of stopped. It's more so those voices are. It's less. It's less. Actually, that's a good. I don't think of those voices as hallucinations. I think of them as just like part of my natural thought process. So it was actually weird when I started to get medicated because um, I suddenly started to hear those voices less, and it kind of messed up with my decision making process. And it still does mess up with my decision making process because usually I would rely on a voice to be like, hey, this is another thing that's happening or thing you're thinking about or thing that you should acknowledge or keep in mind.
Right. Um, how how helpful are things like music or art therapy when it comes to these sort of disorders? Because I know that that's been helpful treating disorders like depression, but I'm not sure if it's been implemented in when it comes to schizophrenia.
Uh, Sorry, it's hard to say. I can't really comment on that because I've never actually gone through speech or like those types of therapies, like the
Sure.
music therapies. So I don't feel comfortable speaking on that.
No, that's fair. Um, so let's see. Did it feel like part of your brain went away after you were medicated?
God, even worse, it felt like I was kind of lobotomized.
I see. Yeah, I find these type of disorders very interesting. I think one has to be careful to not fall too deep into the rabbit hole. I think, but it does put a question as far as like where is the line that we can draw between a real experience and one's one that is hallucinated. If I've is it just how many people can see the same thing? Like these are kind of things that I kind of get stuck on and think about. Um, and yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but I think it's obviously really good that you found a type of method to keep you grounded, so that you can make those distinctions. I just think that sometimes the distinctions seem blurry to me.
Yeah, it is. It's very strange, but I try not to deal too much with what is or isn't reality. What I kind of focus on is what do I want? What are my goals? And what method has the most predictive power such that I can use it to succeed and fulfill those goals? And one of those methods is the scientific method, which makes it, which is super clear cut. It's do X and you will get Y.
Sure. I think I remember reading something about dreams a while ago, and something that was interesting is that the brain doesn't really tell the difference between, for example, like a real tiger and the dream of one. There, as far as what the brain is experiencing when in reality or in a dream, it seems to be very similar. Um, but I think obviously the where the line I think is drawn is the fact that like we do live in a in a world with other people in a global society in a environment that uh, we're not just by ourselves. And so I think, how would I say this? There's a sort of a give and take that we can have, and we can bounce off with other people, and see whether or not our experience is tracking with the overall experience of everybody else as well. Um, would you say that kind of being part of an environment with other people can itself help you stay grounded, or are there anything about the outside world and the people in it that can contribute in a negative way to what you're experiencing?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the things that's really annoying is seeing, especially in today's cultural and political climate, that there are more and more people who will merely not look reality in the face or face it, even though they have the mental faculties to do so. And it's very frustrating because I kind of rely on that to have a good understanding of the world. If other people who do have the mental faculties to figure out what reality is aren't figuring it out, then I'm here who doesn't have all the proper mental faculties to discern reality and hallucination and left stranded trying to figure out what's going on because everyone is saying different things and no one is agreeing on a central reality. So having a group of people around you that I'm sorry, I laughed for a second because someone said we live in a society in the comments, and that is very accurate. Thank you, JR. We do live in a society, but having that network of people around you who can help you get a solid foundation of what is or isn't real or is or isn't crazy is really important.
I think I share with you your frustration uh, with the way people tend to justify the things they believe in. I think a lot of people believe in things just because of feelings they have. And I think they take for granted um, the importance of uh, applying these tools like the scientific method. Um, I think that there's a real danger with just the amount of people that I talk to are like believe in a particular religion because they think they were filled with the Holy Spirit, for example. Meanwhile, for some reason, this Holy Spirit seems to tell everybody different things, and yeah, I think they take it for granted. I think they would take their epistemology far more seriously if they were in your shoes, actually having to not compartmentalize between the way in which they apply reason throughout their everyday life, and then make an exception to these ridiculous religious ideas. If they were fighting this stuff on a daily basis. Let's see. Potts writes, I always have the impression that reality is heavily socially constructed. Seems to be not having social connection makes it harder to understand reality.
I think I kind of get what you mean by that in the sense that, like, depending on the types of information you're exposed to, you'll have a different sense of what is or isn't reality. And I feel like we're seeing this a lot in our current environment where you have all these different views that are being created due to a mismatch in what information people are getting.
Right.
Where the right will like believe an entirely different reality than the left because sorry, one second. Something was stuck in my throat and I had to cough.
No worries.
But the right would have a completely different perspective from the left because the information they're getting might be from like Fox News and Tucker Carlson and stuff like that. While on the left, it might be from MSNBC or CNN, et cetera, and because they have and others and other types of alternative media that the left may look at, such as like Kyle Kalinske or whatever,
Sure.
or the Young Turks, and then the right would look at I don't know Tim Pool and such. But yeah, you have these completely different streams of information, and so you have these completely different realities being generated, and it's really hard because it's like, or it's very frustrating because it's like, hey, there should be one reality or one overlap where all the information seems to make sense, or at least most of it does.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I feel like a lot of people apply misinformation, spread propaganda, ignore the facts that are inconvenient to the reality that they want to be the case. I think there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty out there. And again, I think for people who don't suffer with these disorders, I think it's easier to sort of pretend without having the same type of consequences. But for someone like yourself, who I think you put in a position where you recognize even more so the importance of these tools, because your survival to some degree depends on it, and the quality of your life depends on it. I think you have a unique perspective on how to navigate these issues better. Andre is asking, what social media platforms are you on? Do you have a channel?
I mainly just do dumb stuff on TikTok, like debate dumb idiots on why the Earth is flat, which is mostly just me randomly going live. So if you want to go on and see my TikTok, it's 0_NILZ, 0 nils. But
Sure.
I don't really try and be a public figure of any kind. I just thought it might be interesting to share the perspective of someone who suffers from mental illness in terms of what their epistemological framework is like.
Now, do you have any friends that you talk to that have the same disorders?
Sadly, I don't know anyone who has schizophrenia, but I knew people who had depression and other things. And that's always interesting because when I contrast my experiences with theirs, it's like, oh, actually, I don't want to really compare it because you shouldn't really compare mental illnesses. It's hard to really do so because everyone experiences them significantly differently from everyone else. Like the way that I experience schizophrenia may be very different from how someone else does. There's some commonalities, like the hallucinations. For example, I once looked into a bag that I just bought stuff in, and I saw a whole bunch of eyeballs just looking around, and then I had to put the bag down, sit down, and then rub my temple for a while going, okay, I'm a little crazy. Right. Look back into the box and boom, okay, the eyeballs are gone. I can see what's actually there, which is the stuff I just bought. And those types of things are common amongst everyone, but I don't like to even try to be oh, well, my schizophrenia is like this person's, because they might experience it completely differently. Because like I said before, mental illness does seem to just be a magnifier for what's already there.
Sure. Zachariah says something interesting. A background in science helps me understand reality. Socialization adds another complex layer. Yeah, I think, like I was saying earlier, I think socialization is an important aspect to the way in which you compartmentalize and frame the reality we're experiencing. For me, I think there's a real value in examining and learning about these types of conditions, and how you experience reality differently than other people. I think it can help us inform or become more informed about phenomenology in general. Yeah. So, I appreciate you sharing your situation with us.
No problem. I appreciate you giving me the time to do so.
Are there any particular ideas or concepts or information that you would like to add, that you would like for my audience to be aware of? Anything additional?
I guess I would just like to say, in general, for mental illness, if you have trouble empathizing, don't worry about that. Everyone has trouble empathizing, but if you want to try, imagine most mental illnesses, you just take a very average or simple part of your lifestyle and you just crank it up to an unhealthy amount. So, for example, depression is you're unhealthily sad all the time, or bipolar disorder is you flip between mania, which is an unhealthy amount of emotion or activity or energy, and then an unhealthy amount of the opposite,
Sure.
right, with depressive episodes. And so empathizing with mental illness really just comes down to taking an aspect of something that you think is completely normal and flipping it such that it's gone to an extreme that affects your life in a negative way. And I think I just want to leave with that because I think that kind of tip for empathizing is very useful.
Yeah, I would say, even for people who can't necessarily relate to what those experiences are like, um, just try to listen to the people that are telling you what they're going through, and ask what is it that they need from you. We don't necessarily have to understand uh, what it's like. Um, what matters is that we can communicate and figure out the proper ways to be supportive for those that are dealing with these disorders. Hey, Apostate, good to see you. Zachariah asks if you've tried any hallucinogenic drugs in the past.
Sadly, not sadly, depending on your look, I have. Um, but I did hallucinate before them and I hallucinated after them. Trying probably the most interesting experience was trying LSD. Shrooms didn't do much to me, but LSD did make me realize something that was interesting was that I could have hallucinations that weren't necessarily negative because a lot of my hallucinations at that point were negative, and I usually just categorize hallucinations in general as negative. And then once I had LSD, I realized, oh, I only really seem to hallucinate when I'm stressed or worrying or something. But if I hallucinate when I'm not in that way or that mindset, then I can have positive hallucinations.
Right. Do you know of any support groups that are available for people with schizophrenia?
Sadly, I don't. I think the best thing, honestly, I don't like the idea of support groups in the sense that you get around with a whole bunch of people with the same mental illness. It's honestly healthier to just interact with people who are healthy
Sure.
because it rubs off on you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. That makes sense. I think it adds a layer of stability.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's kind of and not to say you can never become friends with people who are mentally ill or something like that. It's just that when you do, you're adding an extra layer of responsibility if you actually want to be their friend and more than just an acquaintance. And it's are you in the mindset and ability to accept this extra responsibility?
Potts writes, I've heard that in the West, hallucinations tend to be more negative. In other cultures, they tend to be more benign, but not sure how true that is. Yeah, I'm not sure either. But yeah, I think in general, the way that some of these things are viewed in the East and the West tend to be different. But I do have some concern about the ways they're viewed in the East, because I think some of these ways of experiencing are almost, I think there's a sort of fitting into the delusions more so.
Oh yeah,
than,
feeding the psychosis such that they may go off into the deep end and start believing some crazy things.
Yeah, I think that can be problematic. Well, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but do you know of any particular strategies if somebody's having a complete psychotic episode? Are there anything that in particular that can be said, or is it just call 911 type of situation?
Honestly, it depending if you're not equipped for the situation, generally it is better to call a social worker or something. Sure. Or because hey, people are complicated and you don't always have all the answers. But if it's okay, there's no social worker around, usually being able to trying to listen to them is the best thing. And don't affirm what if someone's oh, I think they're people reading my mind, don't be yes, there are. Of course, that's crazy. Sure. But be oh, let's who's reading your mind, blah, blah, blah. and you're like kind of just calm them down, maybe ask questions, et cetera, but never try and push them into a way that you're affirming their beliefs, but never just like outright deny them and make them feel like they're not being heard.
Right. So just finding a balance between being respectful without fitting into it.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Because you don't want to agree and affirm anything that they're like hallucinating, but you also don't want, like, you don't want to enable them, but you don't want to make them feel like they're just talking to a brick wall.
Or make them defensive and that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for sure. Yeah, I don't know if anybody has any other questions before I end the stream. But yeah, this has been really interesting. I appreciate you sharing your experience, your knowledge with us. And
No problem. I just hope it wasn't boring
not
because
at all. No, I'm very fascinated by these type of things and sort of the philosophical implications of having these disorders. And I wasn't bored at all. Like I said, I'm really grateful that you came on to talk with us.
maybe next time we can have a conversation on whether it's moral to, because I've been thinking about this, whether it's moral to medicate people to fit them into society.
Sure. I think it depends, right? I think it depends on what the potential behaviors for those people are, and how they're navigating their experience. Like if somebody, like to some degree, I wonder if a lot of the stigma was taken away and strategies were implemented. If somebody having these hallucinations could have these experiences without sort of the negative perspective or the negative filter.
Yeah, like you have the negative. Oh, yeah, I was about to say filter. You have a negative filter. Instead of getting a negative filter on all the hallucinations, it's interesting to imagine a world where maybe you had a positive filter, right? Because it makes me think of it, and I don't know if other people think about this, but if prophets throughout history were actually just people with schizophrenia who were just smart and were unable to attribute the things that they realized to themselves because they usually heard them as voices or something. And then I'm like, well, if that's the case, then you have these examples of people in history who may be schizophrenic and may have changed a whole bunch of things for years to come.
Sure.
And then attributed it to something else. But that's just crazy speculation. So take it with a grain of salt.
Zacharias says it is moral to give people more utility to act in society. I mean, I can agree to that with that definitely to a degree, but I also think that I think the most moral approach is also to create a framework where these people can function the best, and that may require medication for sure, but for some it may require just a reframing of how one is thinking about these things.
Mhm.
Like I said, I think the question of medication really depends. It has to do with how one is acting. Like if you're more likely to hurt yourself without medication, then yeah, they should be medicated. But I think it really depends. Like maybe there may be other ways of navigating that experience where they're not going to be more likely to do that even without medication.
Yeah, it's a tricky question trying to figure out like, hey, is there a way to solve the problem without medication? And morally, ought we do so? Is there anything wrong with taking medication?
Yeah, I think it's a balance. I think the two can go in hand. Like I think medication is useful and I think life-saving for some people. But I also think that it shouldn't be the only tool used. I think there should be a multitude of approaches to help mental health, whether it's schizophrenia or anything else, really. That would be my perspective on that, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Like you need medication. So I'm like, and I want to just say that because I don't want to get anyone out here being like, maybe I don't need my medication,
Sure.
because that would be crazy.
Yeah, no, right. But yeah, we're hitting the 1 hour mark, so I think I will end the stream here. But like I said, I appreciate you coming on, and would definitely love to have you back sometime.
Appreciate you for having me. Have a good one. Stay
Yeah.
safe, Cease.
Yeah, you too. Take care, and thank you everybody for tuning in. And we'll be back with another episode of Axioms on Trial sometime later this week, maybe in the weekend, something like that. So if there's any topics that you guys are interested in hearing us address, feel free to leave them in the comments, and or shoot me an email at axiomsontrial@gmail.com. And yeah, follow me on TikTok as well as cease to know under on TikTok. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe.